The file. The scent of fried catfish lingered in the air, a comfort and a reminder of home. Little Vince, all 8 years of him, sat cross-legged on the faded green carpet, his chin propped in his hands as his father spoke with a voice like thunder. "You gotta keep your eyes open, boy," Big James said, leaning forward on the couch. His hands were rough, cracked from years of factory work, but when they gestured, they held a kind of authority Vince didn't dare question. Ain't no such thing as a good snake. You see one, you don't pet it, you cut its damn head off. Vince nodded solemnly, though he didn't fully understand. His father's words hung heavy in the small living room, crowded with worn furniture and bookshelves, stacked with titles like The Souls of Black Folk and The Miseducation of the Negro. "But Daddy," Vince ventured, his voice small, "Miss Lily at school gave me a sticker when I got all my spelling words right." "She's nice." Big James let out a bitter chuckle. "That's how they get you, son. A smile here, a sticker there. Next thing you know, they got their foot on your neck, and you wonder how the hell it happened." His mother, standing by the stove, sighed audibly. "James, let the boy breathe. Not every white person's out to get us." Big James shot her a look. "Ain't about every. It's about history. And history don't lie." Vince didn't realize it then, but that conversation would shape how he saw the world. By the time he was a teenager, he'd learned to spot the footsteps of betrayal, as his father called them. The subtle changes in tone, the too wide smiles, the whispers when he walked by. It was in middle school, though, that the lesson became real. Ethan had been his best friend, or so Vince thought. They bonded over comic books and basketball, trading jokes and secrets like brothers, until the day Ethan invited him over to play video games. Vince had barely stepped into the house when Ethan's mom appeared, her eyes narrowing as if she'd just spotted a stray dog. "Don't touch anything," she'd said, her voice clipped. Later, when Ethan's dad's watch went missing, it didn't matter that Vince had been in the living room the whole time, or that he'd never even seen the damn thing. "You people," Ethan's mom had hissed as the cops escorted Vince out, always looking for a handout. By adulthood, Vince had perfected the art of suspicion. He didn't trust smiles, compliments, or kindness, especially not from white folks. His father's voice echoed in his head, a constant reminder. Snakes don't change. They shed. The black Lincoln stretched long and sleek under the streetlights, a polished reflection of luxury Vince never owned but had grown accustomed to. He leaned against the hood, his arms crossed, his black suit and chauffeur's cap crisp and spotless. He had an eye for detail, every crease ironed sharp, every scuff buffed away. It wasn't pride exactly, but something close. This wasn't just a job, it was a mask. In this suit, Vince was invisible, a tool, not a threat. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text lit up the screen. "Pick up at 8:15 p.m., Lawson residence. Client J. Patterson." He rolled his eyes. Patterson again. The man was the worst kind of rich, a banker with a penchant for bragging about his wealth and slurring insults once the liquor kicked in. Vince didn't argue. You didn't argue with people like Patterson. Instead, you nodded, smiled just enough, and waited for them to leave so you could exhale. The drive to the Lawson residence was smooth. Vince's hands gripped the wheel lightly but with precision, his eyes scanning the road ahead and the rearview mirror out of habit. Pulling up to the sprawling mansion, he sighed. The house was more glass than brick, glowing with opulence. Vince climbed out and opened the rear door, his face carefully neutral. Patterson stumbled out moments later, his tie already loose and his face flushed. A blonde woman in a glittering dress followed, giggling at something he'd said. "Vince, my man," Patterson slurred, clapping him on the shoulder. Vince fought the urge to recoil. "Yes, sir," he said smoothly, motioning for them to enter the car. The woman slid in first, her perfume so strong it made Vince's nose itch. Patterson followed, pausing halfway to lean back toward Vince. "You know, you're one of the good ones," Patterson said, his words dripping with alcohol and condescension. "Not like the rest." Vince's jaw tightened. He said nothing, closing the door firmly. The ride downtown was a familiar route, but tonight felt different. The city lights blurred in the side windows, and the faint hum of the engine seemed louder than usual. Vince's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, catching Patterson leaning close to the blonde, his hand creeping up her thigh. "Jesus!" Vince muttered under his breath, adjusting the mirror to avoid watching. "You say something, driver?" Patterson barked, his voice sharp. Vince glanced back, his expression blank. "No, sir." Patterson grunted and returned to his companion, but the tension in Vince's chest didn't ease. Something about the night felt off, like a storm brewing just out of sight. When Vince dropped them off at an upscale lounge, Patterson shoved a crumpled $20 bill into his hand without a word. Vince stared at it for a moment before pocketing it. He hated how they tipped like they were doing him a favor. As he waited in the car, the radio buzzed faintly, a static crackle that made him glance at the dashboard. The station was set to FM, but the interference didn't stop. Then came a whisper. "Vince." His heart skipped. He turned the radio off, staring at the black screen. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Vince." His breath hitched. He looked around the car, his fingers tightening on the wheel. A shadow flickered in the rearview mirror, just for a second. Vince whipped around, but the back seat was empty. He laughed nervously, shaking his head. "You trippin', man. Get it together." But as he turned back to the front, his reflection in the rearview mirror lingered for just a second too long, even as his head turned away. The next night was quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed against Vince's chest and made him feel like something was waiting to pounce. The streets gleamed from a recent rain, the pavement slick and reflective like a black mirror. Vince hated driving in the rain. The way the lights danced on the wet ground reminded him of snake scales, shifting and sliding just out of reach. He had another late-night pickup, a corporate executive this time, a tall white man in his 50s, impeccably dressed, with a stiff demeanor that made Vince feel like furniture in his own car. "Take the scenic route," the man ordered, his voice curt. Vince nodded without comment, adjusting the GPS in silence. Scenic route, he thought bitterly. That just meant the long way, probably so the guy could call someone he didn't want his wife to know about. As they drove through a stretch of empty suburbs, the man spoke into his phone in clipped tones. Vince kept his eyes on the road, but the words filtered through. "No, he doesn't suspect a thing. Yes, the papers are signed. The payout will be substantial. Of course, I covered my tracks." The conversation ended abruptly. Vince's grip on the wheel tightened. He knew it wasn't his business, but something about the man's tone, about the way he said, "covered my tracks," sent a chill down Vince's spine. In the rearview mirror, the man's reflection stared back at him, though his eyes seemed wrong, too bright, too focused. Vince blinked, and the moment passed. The man got out at a high-rise downtown, his departure marked only by a brisk "thanks." Vince watched him disappear into the building before leaning back in his seat, exhaling slowly. That was when he saw it. A briefcase sat on the seat where the man had been, sleek and black, its surface unblemished. Vince frowned. He hadn't seen the man carry a briefcase when he got in. His first thought was to call the company, but something stopped him. The air in the car felt heavy, pressing against his skin like a humid summer day. "Don't touch it," his instincts warned, but curiosity gnawed at him, louder than the voice of caution. He reached back and pulled the briefcase into the front seat. It was cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been. There was no lock, just a simple clasp. Vince hesitated. "This ain't yours. You don't need to know." But the thought of the man's strange conversation lingered. Covered my tracks. He opened it. Inside was a stack of papers, neatly organized, and an envelope with his name written on it in bold, black letters. Vince Walker. His blood ran cold. He stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity before his trembling hands picked it up. He opened it slowly, carefully, as though the paper itself might bite him. Inside was a single photo. It was a picture of him as a child, no more than 9 or 10, standing in front of his family's small brick house. His father stood behind him, a hand on his shoulder, his face stern as ever. Scrawled across the photo, in red ink, "Snakes don't die. They shed." Vince's breath hitched. He looked around the car, knowing that someone was watching. The shadows outside the car seemed to shift, pooling in unnatural ways under the streetlights. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, startling him so badly that he dropped the photo. The caller ID read, "Unknown." With shaking hands, he answered. "Hello?" For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a low, distorted voice whispered, "Do you trust them?" The call disconnected. Vince sat frozen in the driver's seat, the phone still clutched in his hand. The static from the mysterious call seemed to linger in his ears, buzzing faintly like a distant warning. He stared at the briefcase, then at the photo now lying face up on the passenger seat. His father's stern eyes stared back at him, unyielding even in the grainy image. The shadows outside the car seemed darker now, the pools of light from the street lamps dimmer. Vince's instincts screamed at him to leave, to drive home, to pretend none of this had happened. But something deeper, a pull he couldn't ignore, kept him rooted in place. "Do you trust them?" The words echoed in his mind. He looked around the empty street, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. For the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement, just a flicker of something in the back seat. He spun around, his pulse racing. Nothing. "Get a grip, man," he muttered, though his voice sounded unconvincing even to himself. The drive home was tense. Every car that passed felt like it was following him, every shadow on the sidewalk, a potential threat. By the time he pulled into his apartment complex, his shirt was damp with sweat, and his hands ached from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Vince carried the briefcase inside, locking the door behind him with a series of sharp clicks. Deadbolt, chain, latch. He secured them all, then double-checked each one. His one-bedroom apartment felt different tonight. The usual creaks of the old building seemed louder, the corners of the room darker. He set the briefcase on the kitchen counter and poured himself a glass of whiskey, the liquid trembling slightly in his hand. He stared at the photo again, his mind racing. Who had taken this picture? Why was it in the briefcase? And why did it have his name on it? The next morning, Vince woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. His head pounded from lack of sleep and the whiskey that had done little to calm his nerves. It was his dispatcher. "You're late," the voice barked on the other end. "Your 8 a.m. pickup is waiting." Vince glanced at the clock. 8:13. "Yeah, I'm on my way," he said, already pulling on his suit jacket. He didn't notice the photo on his kitchen counter had shifted slightly, as though it had been moved during the night. The pickup was another corporate client. A middle-aged white woman with sharp features and a Bluetooth headset practically glued to her ear. She didn't acknowledge Vince beyond a quick nod as she climbed into the back seat, already mid-conversation. Vince pulled away from the curb, trying to focus on the road, but his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. The woman spoke in rapid bursts, her words blending into a background hum. But then, just as they approached a stoplight, her tone changed. "He doesn't suspect a thing," she said, her voice dropping lower. Vince's hands tightened on the wheel. "We'll have him under surveillance until it's time to move." "No, he hasn't found out yet, but it's only a matter of time." His chest tightened. She wasn't talking about him. Was she? The light turned green, but Vince didn't move. "Driver," the woman snapped, tapping on the partition. "Sorry," Vince muttered, jerking the car forward. He didn't look back for the rest of the ride, but he couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes on him, even after she'd gotten out. That night, Vince sat in his apartment, staring at the briefcase. He'd avoided it all day, but now, as the shadows in his apartment seemed to stretch and shift, he felt drawn to it again. He opened it for the second time. Inside, beneath the stack of papers, was a small black notebook. Vince flipped it open, his heart pounding as he skimmed the pages. The handwriting was neat, almost clinical, and the entries were dated. June 12th, 1989. Subject James Walker, observation notes, potential for radical influence on community. Recommends surveillance. June 14th, 1990. Subject Vince Walker, age 9. Displays signs of inherited distrust. Close monitoring required. Vince's breath caught. He flipped further, the dates skipping years, but each entry mentioned him. His name, his movements, even details about his life he thought no one could possibly know. The final entry, dated just a week ago, chilled him to the core. January 8th, 2025. Subject has begun to suspect. Stage 2 to commence. A loud knock on the door shattered the silence. Vince froze, his heart hammering. The knock came again, harder this time. "Vince Walker?" a voice called from the other side. The knock came again, louder this time, making the door rattle on its hinges. Vince's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the door, his body frozen in place. "Vince Walker, open the door," the voice demanded. It was deep, authoritative, and unfamiliar. He glanced at the briefcase on the counter, then at the black notebook still clutched in his hand. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something, curiosity, defiance, or maybe just the need for answers, made him take a step forward. Another knock. "I'm not here to hurt you," the voice said, its tone softening slightly. "But we need to talk. Now." Vince's throat tightened. He grabbed a knife from the countertop and held it behind his back as he unlocked the door, leaving the chain latch in place. He cracked it open just enough to see the person standing outside. It was a man in a dark suit, his skin pale, his features sharp and hawk-like. Sunglasses covered his eyes, even though it was well past sunset. "Who the hell are you?" Vince demanded, his voice rough. The man tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "My name isn't important, but what I have to say is—" "Yeah, well, I ain't interested," Vince snapped, moving to shut the door. "Do you think that briefcase just ended up in your car by accident?" the man said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Vince froze, his hand still on the door. The man continued. "We've been watching you for a long time, Vince. Longer than you realize. What's happening now is bigger than you. But if you don't listen, you won't survive what's coming." The chain rattled as Vince slammed the door shut and locked it again. "I don't know what game you're playing, but you got the wrong guy," he said through the door. "You've already opened the briefcase, haven't you?" the man called out. Vince's stomach dropped. "There's no going back now," the man continued. "You've seen enough to make you a target. If you don't want to end up like your father, you'll let me in." The mention of his father hit Vince like a punch to the gut. He stepped back, his mind racing. "How do you know my dad?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I know everything about him," the man replied calmly. "And about you. The snakes are closing in, Vince. If you don't act, they'll swallow you whole." The man's words struck a nerve. Vince's father had always warned him about snakes, how they disguised themselves, how they struck when you least expected it. Vince took a deep breath, then unlocked the door again, this time fully. He kept the knife hidden behind his back as he stepped aside. "Talk," he said, his voice low, "and make it quick." The man stepped inside, moving with the deliberate precision of someone who was used to being in control. He scanned the apartment, his gaze lingering briefly on the briefcase before turning back to Vince. "You've been dragged into something you can't run from," the man began. "The organization your father tried to expose decades ago. They've been watching you ever since he died." Vince's chest tightened. "Expose? My dad worked at the factory. What the hell are you talking about?" The man smirked, as though Vince's ignorance amused him. James Walker wasn't just a factory worker. He was an informant. He stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, and he paid the price for it. Vince's hands trembled, the knife pressing into his palm. "You're lying." "My dad died in a car accident." The man shook his head. "That's what they wanted you to believe. But his death wasn't an accident. It was a warning." Vince felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. Memories of his father's cryptic warnings about trust, about snakes, came flooding back. "Why are you telling me this now?" Vince demanded. "Because you're next," the man said simply. "They've been waiting for the right moment, and you just gave it to them when you opened that briefcase." The man reached into his pocket, and Vince tensed, his grip on the knife tightening. "Relax," the man said, pulling out a small flash drive. He set it on the counter beside the briefcase. "This is everything your father uncovered. If you want to live, you'll need to finish what he started." Vince stared at the flash drive, his mind racing. Before he could respond, the man leaned in close, his expression suddenly deadly serious. "You don't have much time. They're already coming." As if on cue, a car screeched to a stop outside, its headlights flooding the apartment. "Stay low and trust no one," the man said, stepping back toward the door. "Not even me." He slipped out just as another knock, this one harder and more aggressive, shook the door. The heavy knock came again, rattling the door in its frame. Vince's heart pounded as he stared at the door, his mind racing. Whoever was out there wasn't waiting for an invitation. He grabbed the flash drive and stuffed it into his pocket. The briefcase sat on the counter, but Vince ignored it. He couldn't carry everything, and every second wasted felt like an eternity. The knock turned into a loud bang. "Mr. Walker, we know you're in there," a gruff voice called out. "Open up now." Vince's instincts screamed run. He grabbed his jacket and darted toward the window in the bedroom, shoving it open with trembling hands. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but he didn't hesitate. The banging at the door turned into crashing. They were breaking it down. He climbed out onto the fire escape, his feet slipping slightly on the wet metal. Below, the alley stretched out dark and narrow, with only a faint glow from a distant street lamp. Vince glanced over his shoulder. Through the window, he could see shadows moving in his apartment. The intruders were inside. Gotta move. Now he hurried down the fire escape, every creak and groan of the metal stairs sounding like a gunshot in the quiet night. When he reached the bottom, he jumped the last few feet, landing hard on the pavement. A black SUV idled at the mouth of the alley, its engine rumbling low. Vince ducked behind a dumpster, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He peeked around the edge, his heart sinking as he saw two men in dark suits step out of the SUV, scanning the area. They were methodical, their movements precise. These weren't regular cops or thugs. They were professionals. Vince's mind raced. He couldn't go back to his apartment, and he sure as hell couldn't fight these guys. He needed a distraction. His eyes fell on a stack of empty beer bottles near the dumpster. Quietly, he grabbed one, then hurled it toward the far end of the alley. The glass shattered loudly against the pavement, echoing off the walls. The men snapped their heads toward the noise, drawing guns from their holsters. "Check it out," one of them barked, motioning for his partner to follow. As they moved toward the noise, Vince bolted in the opposite direction, sticking close to the shadows. The city streets were eerily quiet as Vince ran, his breath puffing out in clouds in the cold air. He didn't stop until he was several blocks away, ducking into a dimly lit parking garage. He leaned against a concrete pillar, his chest heaving. He pulled out the flash drive, turning it over in his hand. What the hell did my dad get into? He thought. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. The screen lit up with another unknown caller. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Vince," the distorted voice said, calm but urgent. "You need to keep moving." "Who is this?" Vince demanded, his voice cracking. "Someone who wants you alive," the voice replied. "But you're running out of time. They'll find you if you don't stay ahead." "Why the hell are they after me?" Vince shouted. There was a pause, then the voice said, "Because your father found out the truth. And now, so have you." Before Vince could ask anything else, the line went dead. Vince gritted his teeth, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He didn't have time to process everything. The briefcase, the photo, the flash drive, the men chasing him. All he knew was that he couldn't stop. He spotted a cab idling at the far end of the parking garage. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward it, doing his best to appear calm. The driver, an older black man with a grizzled beard, glanced at him suspiciously. "Where to?" Vince hesitated. Where could he go? "Just drive," he said, climbing into the back seat. "I'll tell you where once we're moving." The driver frowned but didn't argue. The cab pulled out onto the street, and Vince slumped against the seat, his mind racing. He had no plan, no allies, and no idea who to trust. But one thing was clear. Whatever his father had uncovered, Vince was now at the center of it. The cab sped through the city, the dim orange glow of streetlights flashing rhythmically through the windows. Vince kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the black SUV in pursuit. "Where we going, man?" the driver asked, his tone gruff but curious. Vince thought quickly. "Someplace quiet, out of the way." The driver gave him a side-eye through the rearview mirror. "Aight, don't want no trouble, though." Vince nodded, appreciating the discretion. "Just drive." The cab dropped him off in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of town, far from the gleaming skyscrapers and upscale apartments. Vince paid in cash, keeping his head low as he stepped out and made his way to a small, dingy motel. The neon sign flickered vacancy, casting an eerie red glow over the cracked pavement. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of mildew and cheap cleaning products. The desk clerk, an older woman with tired eyes and a cigarette dangling from her lips, barely looked at him as he paid for a room. Once inside the room, Vince locked the door and pushed the dresser in front of it for good measure. He closed the curtains tightly before sitting at the rickety table in the corner. The flash drive felt heavy in his hand, its significance far outweighing its small size. He pulled out his laptop, a beat-up old thing he barely used, and plugged in the drive. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a folder popped up on the screen, labeled Project Ouroboros. The folder contained dozens of files, documents, photos, videos. Vince clicked on the first file, a text document titled Timeline.x. The words on the screen made his stomach churn. Project Ouroboros, a covert operation designed to infiltrate and destabilize Black communities under the guise of economic development and law enforcement. Initiated 1987. Vince scrolled through the document, each line more horrifying than the last. Phase 1. Surveillance of key community leaders. Phase 2. Planting of false evidence to incite internal distrust. Phase 3. Systematic removal of dissenters through accidental deaths or imprisonment. At the bottom of the document was a list of names, and Vince's heart stopped when he saw his father's name near the top. James Walker, targeted, eliminated, 1995. Vince leaned back, his head spinning. His father had been right all along. The warnings about snakes, the paranoia, the mistrust, it wasn't just fear. It was survival. He clicked on another file, a video labeled Surveillance 12 1994.mp4. The grainy footage showed a dimly lit room, a group of men in suits sitting around a table. One of them was his father. James Walker's voice was clear and steady as he spoke. "You can't keep doing this. People are starting to notice. You think you can just destroy lives and no one will fight back?" A man across the table leaned forward, his face obscured by the poor quality of the video. "James, this isn't a fight you can win. Walk away, and maybe your family will stay out of this." James slammed his fist on the table. "You think I'm afraid of you? I'll expose all of it. The surveillance, the sabotage, all of it." The video cut off abruptly. Vince sat in stunned silence. His father had tried to stop them and they'd killed him for it. Another file caught his eye. Protocols.pdf. He opened it, his eyes scanning the lines of text. The document detailed plans for monitoring individuals deemed threats to the project. One line stood out. Subject: Vincent Walker. Designated for observation. Contingency plan initiated upon breach of parameters. Breach of parameters. Vince realized it must have been the briefcase. Opening it had triggered something, alerted them that he was aware. His phone buzzed on the table, startling him. Another unknown caller. He hesitated, then answered. "You found it, didn't you?" the distorted voice said. "What the hell is this?" Vince demanded. "Why are they watching me? Why did they kill my dad?" "Your father got too close to the truth," the voice replied. "And now, so have you. They'll do whatever it takes to silence you." Vince's grip tightened on the phone. "Who are you?" "I'm someone who's been where you are," the voice said. "If you want to survive, you'll need to finish what your father started. Expose them." The call ended abruptly, leaving Vince staring at the darkened screen. The weight of what he'd uncovered pressed down on him. He couldn't go back to his old life. Not after this. But he couldn't let them get away with it either. Taking a deep breath, Vince copied the files onto his laptop and several USB drives. If they wanted to stop him, they'd have to work harder than that. Vince's mind raced as he stared at the files. He couldn't sit on this information. If the organization was as powerful as it seemed, they'd stop at nothing to bury the truth. But how the hell could he expose them? He was just a limo driver, not some tech-savvy whistleblower. His father's voice echoed in his head. "The snakes are everywhere, but if you cut off the head, the body dies." Vince knew he couldn't fight them directly. He needed to get the evidence to someone who could. Journalists, activists, anyone with the reach to make it public. He grabbed the USB drives and slipped them into his jacket pocket. Then he scrawled a note. "If anything happens to me, take this to the media. Tell them it's Project Ouroboros." He taped the note to the laptop and hid it under the mattress. With the files copied, Vince grabbed a burner phone he'd bought months ago, but never used. He searched online for local investigative journalists. One name caught his attention: Nicole Turner. Nicole was a hard-hitting reporter for an independent Black-owned news outlet. Her articles on corruption and systemic racism had gone viral more than once. If anyone would believe him, it'd be her. He dialed her office number, his hands shaking. "Turner," she answered, her voice brisk and no nonsense. "I've got proof," Vince said, his voice low. "Proof of a government operation targeting Black communities. If you want the story of a lifetime, meet me." There was a pause. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter," Vince replied. "Just meet me at the old Jackson Street train station. Midnight." "Wait." He hung up before she could ask more questions. Satisfied with the plan, Vince sat back, his chest heaving. He was about to leave the room when a sudden thud against the wall made him freeze. It was faint at first, then louder. Footsteps. They'd found him. The door rattled violently, and Vince's blood ran cold. He grabbed the knife from his bag and backed into the corner of the room. "Mr. Walker?" A voice called from the other side of the door. "We don't want to hurt you. Just come out and we can talk." Vince recognized the voice. It was one of the men from the SUV. "Talk?" "Yeah, right." He scanned the room looking for an escape. The window was his only option, but they'd expect that. The door crashed open, and 2 men in suits stormed in, guns drawn. Vince threw himself toward the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind him. A bullet punched through the cheap wood, missing him by inches. "Come on, Vince," one of the men shouted. "You can't run forever." He climbed into the bathtub and pushed up on the small window above it. It was stuck. No, no, no. He rammed it with his shoulder, ignoring the pain. Finally, it popped open. Another bullet whizzed past, shattering the bathroom mirror. Vince hoisted himself through the window, falling hard onto the pavement outside. He scrambled to his feet and ran, weaving through the alleyways behind the motel. Shouts echoed behind him, but he didn't look back. His lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He ducked into a darkened parking lot and hid behind a rusted van, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound of footsteps grew closer, then stopped. Vince peeked out, spotting one of the men scanning the area. "Where is he?" the man muttered into his earpiece. Vince held his breath, gripping the knife tightly. The man turned away, moving further down the lot. Vince seized the moment, slipping out of his hiding spot and making a beeline for the street. He didn't stop running until he reached the Jackson Street train station. The place was abandoned, the once bustling platforms now covered in graffiti and debris. Vince collapsed onto a bench, gasping for air. His body ached, and his mind was spinning, but he was alive. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight. Nicole would be here soon. As he sat in the shadows, Vince tightened his grip on the flash drive. The snakes were closing in, but he wasn't about to give up. The station was dead silent, the faint hum of the city in the distance barely audible over Vince's pounding heartbeat. He checked his watch again. 11:57 p.m. She better show up, he thought. His nerves frayed. A car engine echoed down the street and Vince tensed. He ducked behind a pillar, gripping the flash drive tightly. The headlights grew brighter, then stopped. A black sedan pulled up, its doors creaking as they opened. A slender woman stepped out, her silhouette cutting a sharp figure in the dim light. Nicole Turner. She wore a leather jacket over a fitted black turtleneck, her natural curls framing a face that was sharp and confident. She carried a messenger bag slung across her shoulder and held her phone like a weapon. "Whoever called me better not be wasting my time," she muttered, scanning the station. Vince stepped out of the shadows, his hands up. "It was me." Nicole's eyes narrowed as she sized him up. "You're the voice on the phone?" "Yeah," Vince said, his voice low. "I got what you need." Proof of what?" Nicole asked, her tone skeptical. "Something big, something they'll kill me for if they catch me." Her brows furrowed. "All right, I'm listening." Vince handed her the flash drive, his hands trembling. Nicole looked at it, then back at him. "What's on this?" "Evidence," Vince said. "Government files, videos. A project called Ouroboros. It's all in there." Nicole's skepticism turned to cautious curiosity. She slipped the drive into her bag. "Why come to me? Why not go to the cops or a lawyer?" Vince let out a bitter laugh. "The cops? They're probably in on it. And lawyers don't mess with stuff like this. You've got reach. People trust you. I need this to get out there." Nicole crossed her arms. "You're asking me to risk a lot here. If this is fake, it's not. Vince cut her off. My dad died because of this. They killed him, and now they're coming for me. Nicole studied him, her sharp eyes searching for cracks in his story. Whatever she saw seemed to convince her. All right, she said, nodding. I'll look into it. But if this is as big as you say, you're gonna need more than me. You got a plan? I barely made it here alive, Vince admitted. I don't even know who to trust anymore. Nicole's expression softened slightly. You trust me enough to call me. That's a start. Before Vince could respond, the sound of tires screeching broke the moment. Both of them turned toward the street as a black SUV skidded to a stop in front of the station. Shit, Vince hissed. They found me. Nicole's eyes widened. Who are they? The people who want me dead, Vince said, grabbing her arm. We gotta move. Two men in suits stepped out of the SUV, their movements swift and purposeful. Nicole didn't argue. She followed Vince as he pulled her deeper into the station, weaving through the darkened hallways. They won't stop, Vince said, his voice tight. They'll kill us both if they get that drive. Then we make sure they don't, Nicole said, pulling a compact taser from her bag. Vince raised an eyebrow. You came prepared. You called me to a deserted train station at midnight. What did you expect? She shot back. The men's footsteps echoed behind them, getting closer. Vince and Nicole ducked into a storage room, pressing themselves against the wall. Nicole pulled out her phone and started typing quickly. What are you doing? Vince whispered. Sending a backup copy of the files to my cloud, she replied. Just in case. Vince felt a surge of relief. At least the information wouldn't die with them. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Vince held his breath as the doorknob jiggled. Come out, Walker, one of the men called. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Vince clenched his fists, his mind racing. Nicole glanced at him, her face calm but determined. Stay behind me, she whispered. Before Vince could protest, the door burst open. The door crashed open, and the men in suits stormed in, their guns raised. Vince and Nicole barely had time to react. Run, Nicole hissed, grabbing Vince's arm. They darted through a side door, leading to a series of dark, narrow maintenance tunnels beneath the station. The air was damp and stale, the faint hum of electricity vibrating through the walls. The men's voices echoed behind them, barking orders to split up and search. This way, Nicole whispered, tugging Vince toward a ladder leading upward. Are you sure? Vince asked, glancing over his shoulder. Nope, she said. But standing here isn't an option. They climbed quickly, Nicole going first. Vince followed, his palms sweaty against the metal rungs. They emerged onto a small rooftop overlooking the station. The night was cold and quiet, the city lights glowing in the distance. We're sitting ducks up here, Vince muttered, scanning for a way down. Nicole pointed to a fire escape on the far side of the building. That's our way out. They moved cautiously across the rooftop, keeping low. Below, the men searched the station with flashlights, their beams slicing through the darkness. Vince and Nicole reached the fire escape, but as they started climbing down, one of the men spotted them. There they are, he shouted. A gunshot rang out, the bullet sparking against the metal railing. Move, Nicole yelled. They scrambled down the fire escape, adrenaline fueling their descent. Vince's foot slipped on the last rung, and he landed hard on the pavement, pain shooting through his ankle. Come on, Nicole shouted, pulling him to his feet. They sprinted into the maze of alleys behind the station, the shouts of their pursuers fading with each turn. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged onto a quiet street lined with shuttered storefronts. A lone cab idled at the curb, the driver leaning against the hood smoking a cigarette. Nicole waved him down and they climbed into the back seat. Where to? The driver asked, raising an eyebrow at their disheveled appearance. Just drive, Nicole said, pulling out a wad of cash. The driver shrugged and pulled away, the station disappearing in the rearview mirror. The cab dropped them off at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. The place was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the worn booths and chipped linoleum floors. Nicole chose a booth in the corner, away from the windows. Vince slumped into the seat across from her, his body aching. "You good?" Nicole asked, studying him. "Not really," Vince admitted, rubbing his ankle. "But I'm alive." "For now," she said, her tone grim. A waitress approached, her notepad poised. "What'll it be?" "Just coffee," Nicole said. "Same," Vince added. When the waitress left, Nicole leaned forward. "All right, Vince, spill. Who are these people and what exactly are we up against?" Vince took a deep breath, then laid it all out. The briefcase, the flash drive, Project Ouroboros, and his father's involvement. Nicole listened intently, her expression shifting from curiosity to anger. "Jesus," she said when he finished. "This is bigger than I thought." "You believe me?" Vince asked. Nicole gave him a wry smile. "I've seen enough to know you're not lying. Besides, those goons chasing us weren't exactly subtle." Nicole pulled out her phone, checking the upload progress. "The files are backed up, but we need a plan. If these guys are as connected as you say, they'll try to stop this from going public." Vince nodded. "We need to hit them where it hurts. Make it so big they can't cover it up." Nicole smirked. "You're thinking like a journalist now." "More like a desperate man," Vince said. Nicole's eyes softened. "Desperation makes people dangerous, Vince. That's why they're scared of you." Her words hung in the air, filling Vince with a strange mix of fear and determination. The diner hummed with quiet activity as Nicole and Vince leaned over the table, whispering their plan. The coffee sat untouched between them, the gravity of their situation eclipsing the need for caffeine. "We can't just drop this online," Nicole said, tapping her phone thoughtfully. "A leak like this needs credibility. If we release it the wrong way, they'll discredit it. Or worse, bury it entirely." "Then how do we make it stick?" Vince asked. Nicole leaned back, her mind working. "We need to go straight to the sources people trust. Major independent media outlets, activists, whistleblower networks, people who'll make noise and can't be easily silenced." "That's your world," Vince said. "Who do we start with?" Nicole pulled a small notebook from her bag and flipped through it. "There's a guy I know, Elijah Brooks, investigative journalist. He's exposed corruption in law enforcement and politics before. He's also got contacts with larger platforms that'll run the story." "Can we trust him?" Vince asked, his paranoia sharpening. Nicole nodded. "If he wasn't legit, he'd be dead or bought out by now. But we'll need to meet him in person. No calls, no emails. They're probably tracking everything by now." Vince sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, where is he?" Nicole smiled grimly. "That's the fun part. He's in D.C. The plan was simple but dangerous. They'd leave the city immediately, driving through the night to reach Washington, D.C. before sunrise. The less time they spent in one place, the harder it'd be for their enemies to track them. Nicole paid the bill in cash and led Vince to a nearby rental car lot. She handed him a pair of sunglasses and a baseball cap. "Put these on," she said. "You stick out like a sore thumb." "Gee, thanks," Vince muttered, sliding the sunglasses on. Nicole chose a nondescript gray sedan, paying for it with a prepaid card. As they drove out of the lot, Vince couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Relax," Nicole said, noticing his fidgeting. "We've got a head start. They'll have to catch up first." "That's what I'm afraid of," Vince replied. The highway stretched ahead of them, dark and empty. Nicole drove with steady focus, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. "What made you call me?" she asked after a long silence. Vince hesitated, staring out the window. "You're one of the few people out here fighting for the truth. I didn't know who else would believe me." Nicole glanced at him. "Well, I'm here, and if we pull this off, a lot more people will know the truth." As they approached the state border, Nicole slowed the car. Flashing lights ahead revealed a police checkpoint. "Shit," Nicole muttered. "They're looking for us." Vince's chest tightened. "What do we do?" Nicole pulled off the highway onto a side road, parking under a cluster of trees. She cut the engine and turned to Vince. "We can't go through that checkpoint," she said. "They'll have our descriptions, maybe even the car details. We need another way." "What about back roads?" Vince asked. Nicole pulled out her phone, checking the map. "There's a route that'll take us around the checkpoint, but it'll add a couple of hours." "Better than getting caught," Vince said. Nicole nodded, starting the car again. "Buckle up. It's gonna be a long night." As they drove through winding back roads, Nicole worked on a plan to contact Elijah once they reached D.C. "We'll need to meet him somewhere secure," she said. "Someplace public, but not too crowded." Vince frowned. "What about Union Station? Big enough to blend in, but plenty of cameras around if something goes down." Nicole considered it. "Not bad. Elijah will agree to that." They arrived in D.C. just before dawn, exhausted but determined. Nicole parked in a garage near Union Station, and they made their way to the bustling terminal. Nicole sent Elijah a message through an encrypted app, detailing their location and the urgency of the meeting. As they waited, Vince scanned the crowd, his paranoia gnawing at him. "Relax," Nicole said, sipping a coffee she'd grabbed from a kiosk. "Elijah will come through." A man in his late 30s approached, dressed in a casual blazer and jeans. His sharp eyes locked onto Nicole, then Vince. "You must be the man with the truth," Elijah said, extending a hand to Vince. "Depends," Vince said, shaking it cautiously. "You the man who can spread it?" Elijah grinned. "Let's find out." The trio settled into a quiet corner of Union Station's food court, tucked away from the morning crowds. Elijah set up a small laptop, its screen glowing faintly in the early light. Nicole handed him the flash drive. "Everything's on there. Files, videos, names. This is big, Elijah." Elijah glanced at Vince. "You're the one who got this?" "Yeah," Vince said, his voice tense. "And they've been hunting me ever since." Elijah nodded, inserting the drive into his laptop. His face was calm, but his hands moved with precision, typing commands to open the files. The first document appeared. A spreadsheet detailing financial transactions linked to Project Ouroboros. Elijah's brows furrowed as he scrolled through the names of shell companies, politicians, and corporate executives. "This is insane," Elijah murmured. "These aren't just random names. These are some of the most powerful people in the country." "That's not all," Nicole said, leaning closer. "Check the video folder." Elijah opened it, revealing dozens of files labeled with dates and locations. He clicked on one, and a grainy video played. A secret meeting in a boardroom. Men and women in suits discussed restructuring initiatives for underserved communities, code for gentrification, displacement, and resource stripping. Elijah's jaw tightened. They're openly strategizing how to destroy Black neighborhoods, and they're doing it under the guise of economic development. He moved to another file, a series of reports detailing experimental medical trials. Vince flinched as the words flashed on the screen. Target population: African Americans, urban areas. "These trials," Elijah said, his voice low, "they're unapproved. They're using people as lab rats. They killed my father, Vince said suddenly, his voice trembling. He worked for them and tried to expose it. They made it look like an accident, but it wasn't. Elijah looked at him, his expression grave. I believe you. This is bigger than anything I've ever seen. If this gets out, it could take down careers, maybe even topple institutions. But that's the problem, Nicole interjected. They'll do everything to stop it. This can't just be an article on your site. We need maximum exposure. Elijah leaned back, rubbing his chin. We'll need to coordinate with trusted platforms. Independent Black media, activist networks, even international outlets. Once this goes live, it has to hit everywhere at once. Vince frowned. How long will that take? A few days, Elijah admitted. We need to verify the data and set up secure communication channels. If we rush this, they'll use any mistake to discredit us. Vince's shoulders sagged. I don't know if I have a few days. They're closing in. Nicole placed a hand on his arm. We'll keep you safe. You've made it this far. You're not dying before the truth comes out. Elijah nodded. In the meantime, lay low. I'll reach out when we're ready to launch. Where can we go? Vince asked. I've got a safe house, Nicole said. It's not much, but it's off the grid. Elijah stood, closing his laptop. Be careful. Once this hits, the fallout will be massive. They'll come at us with everything they've got. Vince looked him in the eye. Just promise me you'll get it out there. Elijah held his gaze. You have my word. As Elijah disappeared into the crowd, Vince and Nicole exchanged a glance. Think he can pull it off? Vince asked. Nicole nodded. If anyone can, it's Elijah. But we've got a long way to go before we're in the clear. The safe house was tucked deep in Maryland's rural backroads, far from the surveillance-laden streets of the city. Nicole's beat-up GPS directed them to a small, weathered cabin surrounded by towering pines. This it? Vince asked, staring at the modest structure. Yeah, Nicole said, cutting the engine. Used to belong to an old friend. He's long gone, but the place is still secure. The cabin looked abandoned, with its peeling paint and overgrown yard, but Nicole moved with purpose, retrieving a key from a hidden compartment under a loose plank on the porch. You sure no one knows about this place? Vince asked, scanning the woods nervously. Nicole shot him a look. You got a better option. Fair point, Vince muttered. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A single room with a small kitchenette, a cot, and a worn-out couch. The air smelled faintly of wood and dust. Make yourself comfortable, Nicole said, dropping her bag on the counter. We're staying here until Elijah's ready. Vince paced the room, his nerves still raw. I don't know if I can just sit here while people are out there trying to kill us. Nicole opened a cabinet, pulling out a small safe. She entered a code, revealing a handgun and a stack of cash. She placed the gun on the counter. Then don't sit, she said. Be ready. The hours dragged on, the stillness of the woods amplifying every creak and rustle. Vince couldn't relax, his paranoia gnawing at him. Do you think Elijah will really get this out there? He asked, breaking the silence. Nicole sat on the couch, cleaning the handgun with practiced efficiency. Elijah's the real deal. He'll come through. The question is whether we'll be alive to see it. Comforting, Vince muttered, slumping onto the cot. Nicole smirked. Look, I get it. You've been running for your life. And now you're stuck here with nothing to do but wait. It sucks. But we're not powerless. Vince raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Nicole leaned forward. We've got the truth on our side. They're scared because they know if this comes out, they lose. Remember that. That night, Vince's dreams were anything but restful. He saw his father again, standing in a cold, sterile lab. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes filled with fear. They're watching you, Vince. his father said, his voice distorted. Don't trust anyone. Suddenly, the dream shifted. Vince was back in the limo, driving through a foggy city. The briefcase sat in the passenger seat, glowing faintly. A voice whispered from the back seat, "You'll never escape." Vince jolted awake, his heart racing. He sat up, gasping for air. "Bad dream?" Nicole asked, her voice soft. She was sitting by the window keeping watch. "Something like that," Vince muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Nicole didn't press him. Instead, she handed him a bottle of water. "Get some rest," she said. "I'll keep watch." The next morning, Nicole handed Vince a burner phone. "Elijah sent a message. He's making progress, but he needs more time. He also warned us to stay alert. There's chatter about us." Vince's stomach churned. "Chatter?" "People are looking," Nicole said. "We need to stay off the radar." Vince nodded, but his unease grew. Every noise outside the cabin felt like a threat. Nicole walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're almost there, Vince. You've made it this far. Don't lose your head now." Her words steadied him, if only for a moment. The cabin felt like a time capsule, with nothing to distract them but their thoughts and fears. Vince and Nicole spent the morning in silence, each lost in their own preparations. Nicole spread out a map of the East Coast on the small kitchen table, marking potential routes and safe meeting spots. "If things go south, we'll need an escape plan. No doubling back, no predictable patterns." Vince nodded, watching her. "And if they find us before we're ready?" She looked up, her face calm but serious. "Then we fight." Nicole handed Vince the handgun she'd pulled from the safe. "Ever used one of these?" Vince hesitated, the weight of the weapon foreign in his hand. "Not really. My dad was more about fists and words than guns." "Well, you're gonna learn today," Nicole said, leading him outside to a makeshift target, an old rusted metal bucket. She stood behind him, adjusting his stance. "Feet shoulder-width apart. Hold it steady but don't grip too tight. And for God's sake, don't flinch." Vince took a deep breath, focusing on the target. He pulled the trigger, the recoil jerking his arm. The bullet missed wide, kicking up dirt. Nicole smirked. "Not bad for a first shot. Let's try that again." After an hour of practice, Vince's aim improved. He wasn't an expert, but he could hit a target consistently enough to feel confident. Nicole set the gun down and leaned against a tree. "You're a quick learner. That's good. If we're cornered, you'll need to hold your own." "You think it'll come to that?" Vince asked. Nicole shrugged. "I always plan for the worst. That way I'm not surprised when it happens." Back inside, Nicole checked the burner phone. A new message from Elijah lit up the screen. "Files verified. Contacts mobilized. Drop the signal at 7 p.m. sharp tomorrow. Stay hidden until then. They're getting desperate." Nicole read it aloud, her jaw tightening. "This is it. Tomorrow the world finds out." Vince leaned against the counter, the weight of the moment sinking in. "What happens after that?" Nicole's eyes softened. "That depends. If they can't spin it, we might actually have a chance to breathe." "And if they do spin it?" Vince asked. Nicole didn't answer. That evening, they prepared for the final push. Nicole laid out a small arsenal, 2 handguns, a hunting knife, and a taser. Vince packed the essentials, burner phones, cash, and backup copies of the files on encrypted drives. "Worst case," Nicole said, "you take the files and run. Don't stop until you're safe." "You think I'd leave you behind?" Vince asked. Nicole raised an eyebrow. "If it's between saving me and saving the truth, you save the truth." "This isn't just about us, Vince." Her words hung heavy in the air, but Vince nodded. "All right, but let's hope it doesn't come to that." As the night deepened, the tension between them eased slightly. Nicole poured 2 small glasses of whiskey from a dusty bottle she found in the cabin. "To surviving another day," she said, raising her glass. Vince clinked his against hers. "And to getting the truth out there?" They drank in silence, the warmth of the whiskey a brief reprieve from their fears. Nicole set her glass down and looked at Vince. "You know, I didn't expect you to make it this far." "Gee, thanks," Vince said, smirking. "I'm serious," Nicole said. "Most people would have folded under this kind of pressure. But you've got fight in you." Vince shrugged. "I guess I didn't have a choice." Nicole smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." The next morning, Vince woke to the sound of birds chirping outside. The day was clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in their lives. Nicole handed him a cup of instant coffee. "You ready?" Vince took a sip, the bitterness jolting him awake. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Good," she said, checking her watch. "Because after tonight, nothing will ever be the same." The day stretched on slowly, each hour an agonizing reminder of the impending chaos. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Nicole and Vince finalized their plan. The drop was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp. The encrypted files would be sent to several independent media outlets and activists. The truth would spread like wildfire, and there would be no turning back. Nicole checked the time on her phone. "It's almost time. You ready?" Vince stood by the window, his gaze flicking nervously over the cabin's surroundings. "I've been ready, just hoping we don't get interrupted." "Interruptions aren't in the plan," Nicole said with a strained smile. "We've been careful. We'll be fine." The peaceful evening was suddenly shattered by the sound of tires screeching outside. Vince froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He rushed to the window, peering out through the cracked blinds. A black SUV skidded to a halt in the driveway. The engine cut out, and Vince could hear the sound of doors slamming open. "Shit," Vince whispered. "They found us." Nicole grabbed the burner phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she checked for any messages. None. "It's too early. Elijah said we had until 7, Nicole muttered. She took a deep breath, standing up straight. "We have to move. Now." Nicole grabbed the duffel bag with their supplies and rushed to the back door. Vince was already at the small hidden exit that led into the woods behind the cabin. "We need to get to the car. Stay low, stay quiet," Nicole ordered, her voice sharp with urgency. They slipped out the back, the trees surrounding them like dark sentinels as they moved with practiced stealth. The crunch of leaves underfoot seemed deafening in the otherwise silent night, but as they reached the tree line, a sudden movement caught Vince's eye. He turned, eyes wide, just as he spotted a figure emerging from the darkness. A tall man, clad in black tactical gear, his face obscured by a mask, holding an assault rifle. "Shit!" Vince hissed. "We're boxed in!" Without warning, the man raised his rifle and fired. A bullet whizzed past Vince, embedding itself into the bark of a nearby tree. He ducked instinctively, pulling Nicole to the ground with him. "Go!" Vince hissed. "Run!" Nicole didn't need any further prompting. They sprinted through the trees, the sounds of boots crunching behind them. Multiple men closing in fast. Vince's mind raced. Who the hell are these people? The duo ran for several hundred yards, the cabin now out of sight. But it wasn't enough. As they came into a clearing, 2 more masked men appeared from the shadows, blocking their path. "Shit, we're surrounded," Nicole said, breathless. The men raised their rifles, their eyes cold and merciless. "Give it up," one of them shouted, his voice muffled by the mask. "We know you have the files. You can't escape." Vince and Nicole exchanged a glance, desperation seeping into their eyes. They were outnumbered, and the night was growing colder with every passing second. Nicole grabbed Vince's arm, pulling him behind a large tree for cover. "We can't fight them all. We need to get back to the car." Vince scanned the area, his mind spinning. I'm not going back. Not without those files getting out. Nicole gripped the handgun in her hand, her knuckles white. All right then, we make a run for it. On my mark. The sound of footsteps grew louder. 1, 2. Vince's heart hammered in his chest. The tension was unbearable. The men were getting closer. 3, Nicole shouted. They bolted in separate directions, running in erratic zigzags to throw off their pursuers. Vince's legs burned with the effort, his lungs screaming for air. But he pushed forward, feeling the heat of the chase closing in behind him. Suddenly, a crackling voice came from the radio one of the masked men carried. Targets on the move. Prepare to intercept. They're calling for backup, Vince grunted to himself, his feet pounding against the forest floor. A shot rang out, narrowly missing him. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw one of the men aiming at him. The man fired again, the bullet hitting the tree just inches from Vince's head. Nicole was ahead, ducking between trees, trying to draw attention away from Vince. He had no choice but to follow her lead. Just as they reached the edge of the woods, a screeching noise split the night air. A car engine revving, tires screeching across the dirt road. It's the car, Vince shouted. Nicole's eyes widened. She saw their getaway vehicle parked at the edge of the woods, just out of sight of the men. Hurry! Vince sprinted ahead, reaching the car just as the first of the men broke through the trees behind them. Nicole had already started the engine, the headlights flashing to life. Vince jumped in, slamming the door shut as the man took aim. A shot shattered the rear window, but they were already speeding off, the tires screeching as they raced down the road. The masked men weren't far behind, but Vince didn't care. They had made it this far, and they weren't stopping now. Nicole drove like a bat out of hell, her hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckle determination. The shattered rear window whistled with the rush of air, and Vince could still hear gunfire echoing faintly behind them. We can't go straight to the drop point, Nicole said, her voice steady despite the chaos. They'll expect that. We need a detour. Vince nodded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Where are we going? There's a storage facility about 30 miles from here, Nicole replied. Elijah set it up as a backup. We'll stash the files there and use the remote upload system he installed. Vince glanced at the duffel bag at his feet, the weight of their mission almost unbearable. This is the only copy, right? Nicole shot him a quick look. No, but it's the most complete version. If we lose this, the fallout will be smaller. We can't let that happen. They drove in tense silence, constantly checking the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. The back roads twisted and turned, the forest giving way to rolling fields and scattered farmhouses. Eventually, Nicole pulled into a nondescript storage facility on the outskirts of a small town. The place was eerily quiet, bathed in the orange glow of security lights. This is it, she said, cutting the engine. Vince grabbed the duffel bag, his palms sweaty. What now? Nicole led him to a unit near the back of the lot. She unlocked the door with a keypad, revealing a small reinforced room outfitted with a computer, a satellite modem, and a backup generator. Elijah set this up for emergencies, Nicole explained, booting up the system. We upload the files here, and the network takes care of the rest. It'll hit dozens of platforms simultaneously. Nicole inserted the flash drive into the computer. The screen blinked to life, showing a progress bar as the files began uploading. Come on, Nicole muttered under her breath, her fingers drumming against the desk. Vince paced the small room, his nerves on edge. How long is this gonna take? About 15 minutes, Nicole said. As long as the connection holds. Vince froze, his ears straining. Do you hear that? Nicole stopped typing, her hand hovering over the keyboard. In the distance, the faint hum of an engine grew louder. They're here, Vince whispered. Nicole pulled out her handgun, her jaw set. We hold them off until the upload is done. Once it's live, none of this matters anymore. The engine grew closer, followed by the sound of tires crunching over gravel. Vince peered out the small window and saw 2 SUVs pull into the lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. "They brought backup," he said, his voice tight. Nicole nodded. "They always do." The first masked man emerged from an SUV, his rifle raised. Nicole didn't wait. She fired a warning shot, the bullet ricocheting off the hood of the vehicle. "Stay inside," she ordered Vince. "I'll buy us some time." Vince hesitated. "I'm not leaving you out there alone." Nicole turned to him, her expression fierce. "If you don't keep that upload going, none of this matters. Stay focused." Reluctantly, Vince nodded, retreating to the computer. The progress bar inched forward, mocking his sense of urgency. Outside, Nicole moved like a ghost, darting between shadows and firing precise shots. She took down one of the masked men with a clean hit to the shoulder, forcing the others to retreat momentarily. "You're wasting your time," one of them shouted. "Hand over the files, and we'll let you live." Nicole smirked, her voice cutting through the night. "I've heard that one before." She fired again, shattering the windshield of one SUV. Inside, Vince stared at the screen, willing the progress bar to move faster. It finally reached 100%, and a confirmation message appeared. "Upload complete. Files disseminated." He exhaled shakily, his heart pounding. "It's done," he whispered. Nicole burst through the door, her face flushed but determined. "You good?" Vince nodded. "It's out there." Nicole smiled grimly. "Then let's get the hell out of here." They grabbed the remaining supplies and bolted out the back of the storage unit, avoiding the approaching SUVs. The 2 of them disappeared into the woods, moving quickly and silently. The sound of distant shouts and engines faded as they put more distance between themselves and their pursuers. As they reached a remote trail, Vince looked at Nicole. "Do you think it'll work? That they'll see it?" Nicole nodded, her expression softening. "It's out there now. The truth can't be buried anymore." For the first time in weeks, Vince felt a flicker of hope. The sun rose over a chaotic world. Nicole and Vince had made it to a small, secluded motel, far enough from the storage facility to avoid detection. They lay low, keeping the television on low volume and scrolling through burner phones for news updates. By mid-morning, the impact of the upload was impossible to ignore. Every major news outlet was running the story. Explosive evidence exposes deep corruption at the highest levels. Documents reveal government ties to surveillance. Targeting of Black activists. Leaked files detail corporate complicity in systemic racism and exploitation. Vince stared at the screen, his heart pounding as footage of redacted documents and anonymous whistleblowers flashed across the broadcast. Pundits debated the implications, while online commentators pored over the files that had spread like wildfire. Nicole sat beside him, her arms crossed. "It's everywhere. They can't silence this." "They'll try," Vince said, his voice heavy. "They always do." Nicole nodded. "Yeah, but this time people are watching." Social media erupted with outrage and demands for accountability. Hashtags like "UNCH expose the truth" and "justice" for the oppressed trended worldwide. Protests began to swell in major cities as people took to the streets, galvanized by the revelations. Footage from activists' live streams showed crowds chanting, "No more lies. No more lies." "What do you think Elijah's doing right now?" Vince asked, staring at a protest on TV. Nicole smirked. "Probably watching this and grinning like an idiot. He'll lay low for a while, just like us. But he'll be proud. Despite the public outcry, the powers that be didn't stay silent." A well-crafted press release from a government spokesperson called the files an incomplete and misleading misrepresentation of standard practices. News outlets sympathetic to the establishment ran stories discrediting the leaks, calling them the work of extremists, intent on creating chaos. "They're already spinning it," Vince said, his fists clenched. "Of course they are," Nicole said, "but spin can't erase proof. They're scrambling because they know they've lost control of the narrative." As the story spread, so did the danger. Activists reported being followed, harassed, and in some cases arrested on dubious charges. A few journalists who reported on the files received anonymous threats. Nicole checked her burner phone, scrolling through encrypted messages from trusted contacts. "They're coming down hard on anyone connected to this. We need to be careful." Vince leaned back against the wall, the weight of their actions pressing down on him. "We knew this would happen. But damn, it's hard to watch." Nicole placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did the right thing. And now it's bigger than us. They can't stop it." By the evening, the first resignations hit the news. A prominent senator named in the files stepped down, claiming he wanted to focus on his family. A major corporation implicated in exploiting marginalized communities announced a sudden restructuring. Vince and Nicole exchanged a glance as they watched the announcements. "They're scared," Vince said, a flicker of satisfaction in his voice. Nicole smiled faintly. "Good. Let them sweat." Late that night, Nicole's burner phone buzzed with a message from Elijah. "You did it. The truth is out, and they can't stop it. Lay low for now. You've earned it." Nicole showed the message to Vince, who let out a long sigh of relief. "For the first time, it feels like we actually made a difference," he said. Nicole leaned back, a rare smile crossing her face. "We did. And now, the world has to deal with the truth." For the first time in weeks, Vince felt a sense of peace. The files were out, the truth was spreading, and the world was waking up. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for now, they had done their part. "What happens next?" Vince asked as he looked out the motel window at the quiet street below. Nicole shrugged, her voice calm. "We keep moving, we keep fighting, but for now, we rest." Vince nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "For now?" The motel room was silent except for the faint hum of the mini-fridge in the corner. Vince sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the dark street below. The weight of what he and Nicole had done settled on him. Not as a burden, but as a profound realization. They had changed something. Maybe not everything, but enough to crack the system. Nicole sat across from him at the small table, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She broke the silence first. "You've been quiet all day," she said, her tone soft. "What's on your mind?" Vince didn't turn to face her right away. "I was thinking about my mom." Nicole tilted her head, waiting. "She used to say the truth would set us free," Vince continued, his voice low. "But back then, I didn't believe her. I thought the truth only made things worse. You know, opened you up to more pain." "And now?" Nicole asked. He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Now I think she was right. It's not about what happens after the truth comes out. It's about not letting the lies keep you in chains." Nicole nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "She sounds like she was a smart woman." "She was," Vince said, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. Later that night, as they packed up to leave the motel, Vince found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his childhood, the warnings from his parents, the fear they'd instilled in him about the world. He thought about how that fear had shaped him, made him suspicious, guarded, always waiting for betrayal. And then he thought about now. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was running from something. Instead, he felt like he was running towards something. As he zipped up the duffel bag, Nicole spoke from the doorway. "You ready?" Vince met her gaze and nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The files continued to dominate headlines, and the pressure on those in power intensified. Lawsuits were filed, investigations were launched, and the public demanded transparency like never before. Activist groups organized with renewed energy, using the leaked files as evidence to bolster their causes. Across the country, communities that had long been ignored found a new sense of purpose. And though the establishment fought back, using propaganda, arrests, and intimidation, it was clear that the tide was turning. For Vince, the world's transformation felt distant, like watching a storm roll across the horizon. He and Nicole moved frequently, staying ahead of any potential threats. But in their quiet moments, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in years: pride. One night, as they watched a news segment about another politician resigning in disgrace, Nicole turned to him. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Vince shook his head. "Not for a second." She smiled. "Good, because neither do I." Months later, Vince found himself in a small town, far from the chaos. He'd grown a beard, traded his suits for simple clothes, bought himself some land, and started working at a community center. He didn't tell the people there about his past. To them, he was just Vince, the quiet man who fixed things, mentored the kids, and listened without judgment. One afternoon, a young boy approached him after a group session. The boy's name was Marcus, and he had the same guarded look Vince once had as a kid. "Why do you do all this?" Marcus asked, his voice skeptical. Vince smiled faintly. "Because somebody did it for me once, and because the truth's too important to keep to yourself." Marcus nodded, as if trying to understand. "The truth's scary, though." "It is," Vince admitted, "but it's worth it." That night, Vince sat on the porch of his small house, watching the sun set over the horizon. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The world was far from perfect, but he knew he'd played his part. And he'd keep playing it, in whatever quiet way he could. As the stars began to appear, Vince leaned back in his chair. Letting out a deep breath, the truth had set him free, and now he was finally ready to live.